and basically we work to try to keep folks out of the deportation system by doing trainings, running a free hotline, and working with community-based organizations. And then we also try to change the laws so the deportation system isn't as terrible as it is today. So I'm going to talk pretty briefly today basically about how the immigration system interacts with the criminal justice system and give a little lay of the land in New York and maybe touch upon a little bit of current bills pending in Congress and how that might impact some of this. So basically, deportation, is when someone who is not a U.S. citizen is removed from the United States. And often when people are removed from the United States, sometimes they can't come back for a certain amount of time, and sometimes they can never come back. And I think there's a lot of confusion in different communities about who can face deportation. I think a lot of people know that basically just for being undocumented, you can face deportation, and so that's a big category of folks. So maybe you crossed the border without any kind of authorization, or you originally came on a visa, it could have been a tourist visa, student visa, and you overstayed that visa. So those are folks that don't have documentation. And then there's this other big category of folks who can be deported who have some kind of valid status. So maybe a green card, maybe TPS, maybe you're an asylee, and you have committed, you have been accused or committed of a certain criminal offense. And Patricia over there is going to go into much more detail about what kinds of criminal offenses can bring people into the deportation system. But there's a lot of misinformation, and sometimes really, really minor offenses, even things that can be like tickets, can put you in the deportation system. So I think what Patricia's going to talk about later is really important for folks to know. And so the way that immigration finds people, they have a whole bunch of different ways, and it's different across the country. So we know that when people travel internationally, so say you're coming back from a vacation, and you are coming back into the country, usually immigration will then check to see if you have any past criminal convictions. So even if you have a green card, they'll check and see if you're potentially deportable. So that's a big way that people are caught up. People applying for some kind of immigration benefit, so it could be renewing a green card, renewing TPS, applying for naturalization. That's another time when immigration checks and sees if you're someone that they could try to deport. And I know Angela talked earlier about, they have this basically de facto quota, so if you fit within that, there's a good chance that they might try to go after you. There are also home raids and workplace raids. Those are a little bit less common in New York than other parts of the country, although we've been hearing more about home raids, so that might be on the rise in New York. And then what I'm going to talk about mainly is through the criminal justice system, because that's really the biggest place that, under the Obama administration, they're targeting to find immigrants that they can deport. So there's three main programs that I'm going to talk about that constitute immigration enforcement through the criminal justice system. 287G I'm not going to focus on because we don't have that in New York City, but that you may have heard about that in other places in the South or in Arizona, places like that, where basically local police are deputized as immigration officers. But we do not have that in New York City. So the two main programs in New York City are called the Criminal Alien Program. That's a program that's been around for decades, where there's, like Abe mentioned, there's an ICE office, a little trailer at Rikers Island, and they're basically trying to find people that are not citizens who they could potentially deport. And they do that based on information you usually give when you're booked about your place of birth. And they also try to interview folks, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, while you're sitting in jail. Secure Communities is a newer program that a lot of groups that are here fought back against participation in, and we won and got the governor to say New York's not going to participate in secure communities, and then ICE said, too bad, we're doing that anyway. We don't need your permission. So basically this is like a high-tech version of the Criminal Alien Program, where when you give your fingerprints to the NYPD, they send it to databases, to immigration databases, and they can tell if you have ever had any contact with immigration, whether or not you've overstayed your visa, whether or not you have a past order of deportation, and that's how they're kind of quickly locating people who are in the criminal justice system who might be deportable. So I'm just going to go into these programs in a little more detail. And the one common denominator that kind of allows immigration to use these programs is called an ICE detainer or an ICE hold. Have folks heard of, can you raise your hand if you've heard of an ICE detainer before or an ICE hold? So basically this is a request from immigration that some law enforcement agency, either the NYPD or the Department of Corrections, hold you for up to 48 hours to go into immigration custody. It's just a request, but the way that it works is, you know, so say you're identified through secure communities, rather, if you were let go from the NYPD, rather than being let go, they then hold you for immigration to come and pick you up. And I'm going to go into more detail about this in a second. So this is just like a sort of overview of what happens from arrest to conviction, if there's a conviction, for folks in the criminal justice system, and I'm going to talk about where immigration kind of fits into these different systems. So the starting place is, you know, if you're stopped by police or arrested, and, you know, Andrea gave a lot of good information about what you can do, you know, if you're stopped and frisked or if you're stopped by the police on the street. But unfortunately, if you are arrested, then that means immigration may be able to find out about your status. So first, police can check what's called the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, database, looking for what they call immigration law violators. So these are people that have a past order of deportation. Usually they just come up in the database if you have a prior felony conviction. But a lot of folks don't know that they actually have a prior order of deportation. So like the DA presentation about folks filing applications, sometimes people, you know, came into the country, filed an application for asylum, and maybe like they got their work permit and then they never heard anything. You may have been ordered deported even if you weren't there and not know that you have an order of deportation. So this is something that's important to figure out and understand about your immigration case. So when you're booked, so if you're arrested and then you're booked in central booking, you give your fingerprints, and this is where secure communities comes in. When you give your fingerprints, they check your ID and they send it to these immigration databases, and it could come up as either a match or a not match. Now, if you're undocumented and you cross the border and you've never had any interaction with police, odds are that you're not going to come up as a match because they just had never, no, your fingerprints aren't in any database, right? But if you came on a visa, like a tourist visa, or you've ever applied for something through immigration, or sometimes if you have a past arrest, there might be information in the database showing that you don't have a valid immigration status. Now, CAP is still running, so even if you're like undocumented, you never had, they don't have your prints, they'll still ask you your place of birth at booking, and if you weren't born in the US, and we think there's probably a lot of racial profiling in this too, and accent profiling, they might still seek to get more information about you and think that you might potentially be deportable. So if you come up as a match in the database and they see that, immigration sees that, like say you overstayed your tourist visa, they will generally issue a detainer, which is what I said, it's basically a request. It's a form saying, please hold this person, do not release them, until we're, for 48 hours so we can come pick them up. And this has implications for your entire criminal case, even if the charges end up getting dismissed. So it's really important to know whether you have this detainer on you. And when you go to court for the first time, your lawyer should have a copy of that detainer if it's there. And for the most part, we've been talking to lawyers, and Patricia can maybe talk a little bit more about this. They will see whether there's a detainer or not, but they should always ask and make sure, are there any warrants or detainers on this person to make sure whether you have that in your case. If you have a detainer and you go before the judge who's deciding whether to release you, they could release you under recognizance, which means like you don't pay anything, you're just released, and you have to come back to court at a later date, or they can set bail, they can set it at any amount of money, or they can deny bail. If you have a detainer, generally we would recommend that you do not pay bail because you won't be released if you pay bail. You'll just be sent to immigration custody, and if you're sent to immigration custody, you could be sent all over the country basically, and you'll not be able to resolve your criminal case and it can be very difficult to fight your immigration case from where they might send you. So a lot of lawyers will request that bail be set at like $1 or $500 so that people can stay in Rikers for a short time to be able to figure out how they're going to fight their immigration case and whether they can get the detainer lifted on them. If you don't have a detainer, then you want to try to get out as soon as possible, right? So you either ask the judge to release you, or you ask for a very low bail and you try to get out as soon as you can. So say you have a detainer on you, you decide then not to pay bail, so you go to Rikers Island. As I mentioned, ICE is at Rikers Island, and so there's these officers. They used to be ununiformed and just say that they were visiting you as a legal visit, and advocates like Families for Freedom and IDP have worked to get them to wear uniforms and to have a form asking whether or not you want to meet with ICE. Just like you don't want to give the cops information, you don't want to give ICE information. They have to prove in immigration court, it's their burden to show that you don't have immigration status or that you're deportable, and so you don't want to give them any more information. They're not meeting with you to try to help you, they're meeting with you to try to deport you. So when you get this form, I'll show you the form a little bit later, saying, do you want to meet with ICE? We always recommend saying, no, I don't want to meet with them, or I don't want to meet with them without a lawyer. So unfortunately, even if you don't go to that interview, they can still try to deport you and bring charges against you. And so, while you're dealing with your case, it's possible that they'll try to issue what's called a notice to appear, which are the charges basically saying either you don't have a valid immigration status, or you do, but you're deportable for certain criminal convictions that Patricia's going to talk about. But a key thing is when you're fighting your case, there's actually a lot of options for you, because certain offenses make you deportable and certain ones don't. And so you have to work really closely both with your criminal lawyer and often with an immigration expert. So all the New York City Defender offices now have immigration lawyers on staff that should be able to help you and say, this kind of offense will make you deportable and this kind won't. So you need to kind of work with them, or you can call our hotline to figure out what your case is, what's going on. It's pretty complicated. But to figure out either whether you want to take a plea or fight your case and how to best stay in the country. Post-conviction, you can always appeal, or if you have old criminal cases that make you deportable, there are ways to sometimes reopen those cases to fight that. This is what the detainer form looks like. So this is what your lawyer should have and should be able to show you whether or not you have a detainer or not.